Thank you for having me. My name is Kholoud Al Ajarma. I was born and grew up in Aida refugee camp. It is one of the refugee camps in Palestine, near Bethlehem. I am currently in Edinburgh, where I teach anthropology and Islam and Middle Eastern relations. I did not experience being a refugee myself. I was born a refugee. So, being born in a refugee camp, I didn't first realize what it meant as a child because that was what everyday life was like. We were living in a refugee camp. It wasn't what people might imagine a refugee camp to be. We had small houses, for example, we had a school, we had a small clinic, and I thought that everyone lived the same way. But that simply was because the refugee camp has been there for many, many years. And my parents were the ones who actually experienced being expelled from their original village, or our original village, called Ajur, and it is now within the Israeli state. And for me, growing up, I realized it very young when my grandmother, who was also a refugee from Ajor, and my parents had always spoke to me and to my siblings about this other place that we actually come from, and that the camp, although it was our home, it wasn't our homeland, and our homeland was somewhere else, but we are unable to return to it because of the Israeli occupation. In my grandmother's stories, the life in Ajur was very idealistic, and the place itself seemed a bit like Never Never Land, a place that was magical, empty, green lands where people grew what they ate, where life was very much um, very easygoing. People had plenty of water and land. They had cactus that tasted like honey. They had fresh figs that they would eat from their own trees. They planted wheat and barley, and they baked bread that was made from fresh grains. They had a weekly market that the people from neighboring villages would come and visit. The people liked each other and were very friendly towards each other. And in general, the village seemed like a wonderful place, a place where people just enjoyed life and had very, very good relationships. Um, but to me, it seemed like something from a fairy tale because it was very different from the life in the camp, where we had very, very small houses, we had narrow streets, we had no green spaces around, where Aida refugee camp is surrounded by the Israeli apartheid wall from two sides, where we have daily invasions by the Israeli army, where our streets and our houses often smell like tear gas, not like fresh fruit and vegetables. So the life that I experienced as a refugee in Aida refugee camp contrasted greatly from the wonderful experiences that my grandmother would describe from the life in our original village pre 1948 as this magical, wonderful life. And it changed to me when I visited the village as part of a project. I was volunteering at the age of 18, and we were able to take a group of children to 10 villages that were destroyed in 1948. And one of the villages was my home village, Ajor. And then I saw for myself that what my grandmother was describing was actually not imaginary land. It was this huge land, which was very green. And I saw for myself the cactus, the olive trees, the green spaces that were empty, of course, because after the village was destroyed in 1948, like most of the houses were destroyed and so on to prevent people from return. But still, this space was still there, and the village was still empty. And to see that place for me was very touching and very, very emotional, because then it became a reality. And also the right of return itself became something tangible, because I could see that the place is still there, the place is still empty. And the whole legend about the Palestinians being unable to return is because actually there's no space for them to return is actually not true, because at least in the case of my village and several of the villages that we visited as part of this project, the land was there, the villages were almost entirely empty. But what was preventing people from return was the Israeli occupation and its racist policies against Palestinians. I think, in terms of the injustice that had happened to my family, it had left a lot of trauma within the first generation of the Nakba. My parents were children at the time. They have seen the horror of being chased out of the village, and in a way it has been an ongoing trauma or an inherited trauma, because although I haven't experienced what happened in 1948, I still heard the stories, and in a way I could feel what my grandmother and my parents had gone through throughout the years. Given the circumstances, I think we were privileged still, because my parents, who have seen the horrors, believed that, for example, it was important for them to work very hard so that their children wouldn't live through the same financial and economic difficulties that they lived through. So for them, it was very important to educate us, because they believed education is a very important weapon. And if you get proper education, you can get first you can know your rights and know how to defend your rights, but also you can compete and live with dignity in a community or in a world where having financial means are important. So it was important for my parents to get all their children to get proper university education, school education, and university education. And it was important for them to feed us, or put in us, the belief of the right of return and the importance of the cause of our cause as Palestinian refugees. So to learn that, for example, although Israel denies us the right of return, it is a right that, because our land was never sold, our land was never given up, and at the same time, because international law grants us the right of return. Israel might deny it, but we have the right to return to our land. And we should, as long as we live, we should fight for that. We should seek every mean that would allow us to get our right back. I hope that the right of return will be realized in my lifetime. As an individual, I try to do my part in advocating for it, and also in exposing the colonial practices that are happening on my land. For example, what the JNF is doing, which is an organization that claims to be an environmentalist organization, but it creates parks on the lands of Palestinians that were occupied in 1948 and 1967, and even today, with what is happening in the Negev and so on. But in relation to the right of return, I do believe that it is reasonable, that it is justified, and that there is so much space in historic Palestine to take everyone. And because of these reasons, I believe that it is possible, and that with proper advocacy and proper justice, we can realize the right of return. For that to happen, however, I think there need to be a proper pressure put on Israel, by the international community and by international law. I just want to say for the people who are participating in park big run that my first time coming to the UK was with a group of Palestinian dancers when I was 20, and I was so surprised at the time because of the difference between the daily life in a refugee camp and the life in the UK. And I know that not everyone lives the same kind of standard of living, but the fact that we could, for example, get on a bus from London to Hull, and the fact that we could be in parks and without being stopped by army or soldiers, or without being stopped at a checkpoint, was fascinating. And I hope that people who are doing this big run would remember how privileged they are of being able to live in a free country, and to keep us in mind and keep us in their prayers as they complete their run.